By morning, the room was empty. No alarms were raised, no questions were written down, the beds were still warm, and the silence had already begun. Long before anyone understood why, the order arrived without ceremony, not shouted, not explained. Just folded paper, passed hand to hand. It's marked as routine. Everyone recognized the tone immediately. This was not a request. It shouldn't have been her responsibility. It wasn't what she had been trained for. Yet refusal was never mentioned, because refusal had never existed. No reason was given, no end date either. Only one instruction mattered. Follow the procedure exactly. Do not discuss it. Some orders were designed to be questioned later. This one was designed to disappear that night. The lights came on at the same hour. The corridors followed the same pattern. The guards spoke in the same measured tones. And yet, everything felt wrong. She noticed it first in the pause. There was a slight delay before someone answered a question. The way conversations ended too cleanly, as if everyone had already agreed on what not to say. Silence became thicker, not empty. Weighted. She tried to focus on routine, because routine had always worked before. Routine gave shape to uncertainty. But now, routine felt staged, like a performance everyone else had rehearsed. Inside her thoughts, questions formed and dissolved before reaching words. If this is normal, why does it feel rehearsed? This is temporary? Why does no one mention when it ends? No one reassured her. No one needed to. Isolation didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through small omissions. She was no longer included in brief exchanges. Decisions were made a few steps ahead of her. Eye contact shortened. Not rejection. Something more calculated. She realized she was being protected from conversation and protection. In places like this, always came at a cost. Her internal voice grew louder as the external world grew quieter. Every instruction replayed in her mind long after it was given. Every choice felt irreversible, even the smallest ones. She searched for a clear moral line. There wasn't one, only compliance. And everything else, fear, wasn't sharp, it was dull, persistent, the kind that settles into the body and makes time feel heavier. Minutes dragged, not because anything was happening, because something might. She found herself listening for sounds she couldn't name. Footsteps that stopped too soon. Doors that closed without echo, when nothing happened. The relief felt temporary, almost suspicious. She wondered whether the silence was intentional or whether it had simply become habit. Ethical struggle doesn't always arrive as a dramatic choice. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion. The exhaustion of holding responsibility without clarity. The exhaustion of being trusted with something no one will explain. She considered asking questions, then imagined the faces she would see in response. And anger. Not denial, but polite incomprehension. As if the question itself were inappropriate, so she stayed quiet. And in that quiet, something shifted. The longer she remained silent, the more silence felt expected. Guilt didn't arrive with force. It arrived as adjustment. The mind adapts faster than conscience. She told herself this was temporary, that everything here is temporary. But even temporary things leave traces. By the time she noticed the tension in her own body, the careful breathing, the deliberate movements, she realized she was already changing. Not because of what she had done, but because of what she was now part of. And the most unsettling realization came quietly. No one had threatened her. No, that had warned her. Which meant compliance wasn't being enforced. It was being assumed. The change did not arrive as an event. There was no sound to mark it. No raised voice. No interruption. It settled instead, quietly into spaces between routine. At first, she could not identify what felt different. Only that the camp no longer responded the way it used to. Morning procedures began earlier, but not by instruction. Lights were switched on without announcement. Doors were unlocked before schedules required it. No, one commented. She told herself it was efficiency. Adjustment war always demanded adaptation, but efficiency does not erase hesitation, and hesitation was everywhere. People paused before entering rooms they had entered hundreds of times before. Not long enough to be obvious, just long enough to suggest reconsideration. She noticed how footsteps softened near certain corridors, how voices lowered instinctively. There were no signs posted, no warnings issued, which meant the awareness had spread without language. That unsettled her more than any formal rule ever could. The first real break appeared in repetition. Routine relies on sameness. That was how she noticed. Names began to behave differently. During morning checks, some were spoken faster than others, not skipped-compressed, as if saying them too clearly would require acknowledgement. She caught herself waiting for corrections that never came. When a name went unheard, no one looked up. Silence absorbed it. She began to understand that the system was not malfunctioning. It was adapting. Meals followed the same pattern, same preparation, same quantities. Yet trays returned with inconsistencies. No one recorded. No one complained. No one asked whether counts were correct. Accuracy had stopped being important. Appearance mattered more. Objects began to shift, not disappear. A chair angled differently. A lamp repositioned by inches. A curtain tied when it had always been left loose, small enough to be dismissed, persistent enough to be noticed. She realized something subtle was happening. The environment was being softened. Edges removed, markers blurred. It wasn't concealment. It was preparation. The most disturbing part wasn't the changes themselves. It was how quickly everyone adjusted. People matched their pace to the new rhythm. Without discussion, steps shortened, movements slowed, as if urgency itself had become inappropriate. She found herself mirroring it, without meaning to. The body adapts before the mind questions. It happened during a routine exchange. She asked a simple question, nothing specific, nothing sensitive. The response came too late, not delayed by confusion, delayed by calculation. The person across from her met her eyes, paused, then answered. With a phrase that technically addressed the question, without offering anything usable, it was practice ambiguity. She nodded. That nod mattered more than the words, because in that moment, something was agreed upon without being spoken. After that, cause and effect lost their alignment. Asterisk, she would notice a corridor avoided before remembering why. A door locked without recalling when it had last been unlocked. The sequence no longer mattered, only the result. This was when unease began to build, not sharply, steadily, like pressure beneath the skin. Records stopped behaving like evidence. Times overlapped, descriptions thinned, not false and complete. Language shifted toward. Neutrality events were no longer described. They were referenced, resolved, handled, cleared. Words that required no detail invited none. She searched for specificity and found none, and then she noticed something worse. No. One else was searching. Memory began to feel unreliable. She would recall something clearly, then find no confirmation anywhere else. Not disagreement. Absence. As if the memory existed only because she was still holding it. That realization isolated her more than silence ever could. Days started behaving oddly. Some hours dragged with no activity. Others passed too quickly. Leaving no impression, she tried to anchor herself with clocks. Clocks agreed with each other, but not with her. She stopped trusting her. Internal sense of duration that frightened her. Disorientation. It does not announce itself as danger. It announces itself as fatigue. One detail returned. She couldn't explain why it stood out. A sound cut off too abruptly. Not loud, not alarming, just unfinished. The first time she ignored it, the second time she noticed the timing. The third time, she realized she was waiting for it. Each repetition sharpened the absence that followed. The mind seeks completion. That need became the hook. No explanation came. No acknowledgement. She considered asking, then noticed how others reacted when the sound occurred. They did not look toward it. They did not react at all, which meant reaction itself had become forbidden. She realized something important then. This phase wasn't about secrecy. It was about training. Training people to stop expecting answers. Choice narrowed. Quietly, no instruction removed her ability to speak, but context did. Every time she considered asking a question, she imagined the result. Not punishment. Delay, polite misunderstanding. Silence returned as a mirror. The effort would lead nowhere. An effort without outcome drains faster than fear. She felt herself adjusting, lowering expectations, shortening sentences, letting questions dissolve before they reached language. This disturbed her more than the environment itself, because it meant the system no longer needed enforcement. She was participating. By this point, nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything had changed. There was no moment she could point to and say, "This is when it began." Only a realization that the camp no longer reacted to reality. It shaped it. Asterisk. She was still inside it. Nothing happened the way consequences are supposed to happen. There was no moment of exposure, no sudden reckoning, no visible shift that could be pointed to and named. Instead, time passed. And in places like this, time was the most effective eraser of all. She waited for something definitive. A reprimand. A review. A change in authority. None came. That was unsettling. Because consequences, when delayed, become something else entirely. They stop feeling like responses, start feeling like design. Daily operations continued. Not identically, but convincingly. Enough people arrived on schedule. Forms were filed. Orders were followed. The machinery of the place still functioned, but the intent behind it had shifted. The system no longer corrected itself. It absorbed. She noticed the paperwork first. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt lighter. Files that once carried detail now carried summaries. Summaries replaced explanations. Explanations disappeared. Altogether, nothing false was written. That was the clever part. What vanished was density. Language became economical, efficient, careful. The fewer words used, less room there was for memory to settle. She searched for older entries to compare. Some were missing, others had been reorganized. Dates no longer aligned. Neatly crossed dash references led nowhere. It wasn't destruction. It was rearrangement. And rearrangement, it's realized, was far harder to accuse. Meetings still occurred, but their tone had changed. Discussions avoided specifics without acknowledging the avoidance. Statements were framed broadly, then closed quickly. There was an emphasis on closure, not resolution. Closure, as if finishing the conversation mattered. More than understanding it, she noticed how often phrases like "no further action required" appeared. Further than what? Required by whom? Those questions were no longer welcome. People adjusted, not dramatically, incrementally. They learned which topics shortened conversations, which names slowed. Momentum, they learned when to nod, when to redirect. No one instructed them. They learned by watching. That was the most disturbing part. Behavior spread through observation, not command. She realized that survival in this environment no longer depended on obedience alone. It depended on anticipation, knowing what not to bring up, what not to remember. To clearly, memory became a liability. The building itself changed. Not structurally, emotionally. Rooms felt less anchored. Corridors, less directional. She couldn't explain it, but she sensed it. Places that once carried weight now felt hollow, not empty. Neutralized, as if the walls had learned not to react. She wondered how many spaces could be altered without renovation, more than people realize. Those who remained learned quickly. Speaking openly didn't result in punishment. It resulted in isolation, not exclusion. Distance responses became delayed. Engagement thinned. Questions were answered with polite vagueness. Eventually, people stopped asking. Silence wasn't forced. It was rewarded. She noticed how icily language adapted. Statements were softened. Verbs became passive. Responsibility dissolved into process. Things occurred. Actions were taken. No one acted, which meant no one could be blamed. Weeks passed before the emotional weight surfaced, not as panic, not as grief, as fatigue. A deep, unarticulated exhaustion. People moved more carefully, spoke less. There was no shared acknowledgement of strain. Each person carried it privately, which prevented it from becoming collective, and collective awareness, she understood, was the real threat. Certain individuals were no longer mentioned, not intentionally, avoided simply unreferenced. Their absence became a background condition, like a piece of furniture removed. Long ago, at first noticeable, then accepted. She tried to remember when she last heard those names spoken. She couldn't. That frightened her, because forgetting hadn't required effort. This wasn't history being rewritten. It was history being thinned. Edges removed. Details softened. Nothing dramatic enough to protest. Nothing solid enough to defend. And that made it durable. By the time she understood what was happening, there was nothing left to confront, no document to challenge, no authority to appeal to, only a system that had quietly decided which memories were efficient, which were inconvenient, and it had already moved on. By the time the questions surfaced, it was already too late to ask them, not because anyone would have stopped her, but because the questions themselves no longer fit the environment they were meant for. The place had moved on, and places like this always move faster than memory. Years later, she would try to recall when the weight finally lifted. There was no moment of release, no closing chapter, only distance. Time had done what no authority ever could. It softened the edges. Details that once felt sharp now arrived muted. Not erased, just quieter. That frightened her more than forgetting ever would, because forgetting is obvious. This was something else. She noticed it when she tried to explain the experience to herself, not to others, just internally. The language failed. Words felt inadequate, not because they were forbidden, but because they no longer aligned with the emotional reality they were meant to describe. She had lived through something that resisted narrative, and without narrative, memory loses shape. People assume haunting comes from remembering too. Much she learned it comes from remembering incompletely. There was a question that hovered at the edge of thought, not what happened, not who was responsible, but why silence had felt like the safest option. That question refused to solidify each time she approached it. Her mind redirected, not defensively, automatically, as if her thoughts had learned a pattern long ago, never unlearned it. There were no clear figures to assign blame to, no single voice that issued the decisive command, no document that carried undeniable authority. Everything had been distributed, responsibility diluted across process, team timing, which meant accountability had nowhere to land. That was the most enduring consequence. Without villains, there could be no reckoning. Without reckoning, no conclusion, only continuation. Outwardly, life stabilized. That was the cruelest part. Normalcy returned, not dramatically, but convincingly. Days filled themselves again. Conversations resumed familiar rhythms. Anyone looking from the outside would see recovery. But recovery implies repair. This was adaptation. She noticed how easily the mind accepts calm when it arrives without explanation. The absence of conflict feels like resolution, even when it eyes in single quotes, and that illusion is powerful. It teaches people not to look backward. There were no shared anniversaries, no collective moments of remembrance. Everyone carried fragments privately, and private memory has no defense. It bends. It fades. Without witnesses, memory becomes negotiable. She realized then why nothing had ever been officially acknowledged. Acknowledgement creates anchors. Anchors resist drift. The question she never resolved wasn't about guilt. It was about choice. At what point does silence become participation? There was no clear boundary, only a gradual adjustment, a series of small concessions that never announced themselves as decisions. She understood now that the most dangerous choices are the ones that don't feel like choices at all. She returned to that night often not vividly, but persistently, not as a sequence of events, as atmosphere. The sense of compression, the careful movements, the absence of urgency. Nothing overt, which made it harder to reject if it had been violent. It could be condemned. If it had been chaotic, it could be rejected. But it had been orderly, and order carries. Authority, it wasn't hidden because people were afraid to speak. It stayed hidden because speaking felt unnecessary. The system had already absorbed the outcome. Life had continued, and continuation is persuasive. It suggests that whatever happened must have been survivable, acceptable, normal. She realized something unsettling. If asked, no, years later many would say nothing remarkable occurred, and they would believe it because belief adjusts to convenience. What lingered wasn't horror, it was responsibility without outlet, the knowledge that survival had required alignment, not resistance, and alignment leaves no scars others can see. Only a quiet awareness that certain lines were never crossed because they were never drawn. She understood. Finally, why the ending never arrived. Because endings require acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was the one thing this place had learned to avoid perfectly. So the night didn't end. It receded, waiting not to be discovered, but to be accepted as something that simply happened.